German anti-aircraft fire didn't need to hit you directly to kill you. That's the bit that kept RAF crews awake at night through 1940 and 1941. The understanding that flak wasn't about marksmanship, but mathematics. Every shell that exploded within 70 yards of your aircraft sent thousands of steel fragments outward at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. The Luftwaffe had turned the sky into a probability game, and the house always won. By August 1940, RAF Bomber Command was learning this lesson in blood. The Germans had deployed roughly 2,000 heavy anti-aircraft guns across occupied Europe. Mostly the legendary 88mm Flak 36 and Flak 37 models. These weren't crude World War I leftovers. They were precision instruments coupled to mechanical computers that calculated wind speed, target altitude, target velocity, and shell travel time. A well-trained German crew could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute, each programmed to detonate at a specific altitude. They didn't chase individual aircraft. They created kill zones. The statistics from Bomber Command's early daylight raids told a brutal story. On the Cologne raid of 12 August 1941, anti-aircraft fire accounted for 68% of aircraft losses. Fighters claimed the rest. A Lancaster bomber presented a target roughly 69 feet long and 102 feet wide, enormous by any measure, and it lumbered through defended airspace at perhaps 180 to 200 ml rate. At that speed, flying straight and level during a bombing run, you gave German fire control predictors roughly 30 seconds to calculate your trajectory. 30 seconds was an eternity. The mathematical reality was worse than crews imagined. German flak doctrine called for barrage fire, a technique where multiple batteries created a three-dimensional box of explosions that bombers had to fly through to reach their targets. The Ruhr Valley defenses protecting Germany's industrial heartland employed over 1,000 heavy guns by late 1941. Each gun fired time-fused shells that created a lethal sphere roughly 140 yards in diameter. When you multiplied those spheres across dozens of simultaneously firing batteries, the sky became a minefield you couldn't see until fragments were already shredding your airframe. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, taking command of Bomber Command in February 1942, inherited an impossible equation. His Wellington, Stirling, and Halifax bombers simply couldn't survive daylight operations over heavily defended targets. The losses from the Augsburg raid on 17 April 1942 proved it conclusively. 12 Lancasters attempted a low-level daylight attack on the manned diesel engine works. 7 never returned. The survivors came home so badly damaged that 3 were written off, 60% casualties in a single afternoon. So, Bomber Command shifted entirely to night operations, accepting the massive decrease in bombing accuracy as the price of survival. In darkness, German optical rangefinders struggled. Their predictors needed to track targets for several seconds to calculate firing solutions, and searchlights couldn't always hold bombers in their beams long enough. Night bombing reduced losses to roughly 3 to 5% per raid. Still horrific over a 30-mission tour, but survivable for the force as a whole. Yet everyone at High WOM knew this was admitting defeat. Night bombing meant scattering bombs across entire city districts rather than hitting specific factories. It meant thousand-bomber raids to achieve what precision strikes should accomplish with dozens of aircraft. The Germans had effectively won the daylight skies over Europe through mathematics and engineering, unless someone could change the equation entirely. That someone was already climbing into a wooden prototype at Hatfield Aerodrome about to prove that speed could beat statistics. The de Havilland Mosquito shouldn't have worked. That was the consensus at the Air Ministry when Geoffrey de Havilland first proposed it in 1938. A bomber built almost entirely from wood, plywood sandwich construction with balsa core struck the brass as desperation engineering from a company that couldn't secure aluminium contracts. Fighter Command wanted metal Spitfires and Hurricanes. Bomber Command wanted heavy four-engine fortresses. Nobody wanted a wooden twin-engine oddity that looked like something a furniture manufacturer might build. German intelligence agreed wholeheartedly when the first reconnaissance photographs reached Berlin in late 1941. Oberkommando der Luftwaffe reports from December of that year referred to the aircraft as Der Holzbomber, the wooden bomber. Some analysts called it Der Mobile Bomber, the furniture bomber. The tone wasn't just dismissive, it was contemptuous. Germany possessed the finest aircraft industry in Europe, producing all-metal fighters and bombers from Messes, Foch, and Junkers. Britain apparently had been reduced to gluing together plywood. The mockery intensified when German technical intelligence obtained specifications through neutral channels in early 1942. The Mosquito carried no defensive armament in its bomber configuration. No dorsal turrets, no beam guns, nothing. Its bomb load barely exceeded 3,000 pounds internally, roughly one-fifth what a Lancaster could haul. It required two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that could have powered two fighters instead. The entire concept seemed to confirm Nazi propaganda about Britain's industrial desperation. They were literally building bombers from trees. What German analysts missed or refused to believe was the performance envelope those design choices enabled. By eliminating defensive guns and gunners, de Havilland saved roughly 2,000 pounds of weight. By using wooden construction instead of aluminium, he freed up strategic materials whilst creating an airframe that was simultaneously lighter and stronger than conventional designs. Plywood sandwich construction, properly engineered, offered excellent strength-to ratios and actually absorbed more punishment than thin aluminium skins. Cannon shells that would tear catastrophic holes in metal bombers, often punched clean through Mosquito fuselages without detonating. But the real revelation was speed. The prototype DK-290 reached 390 ph during trials in February 1941, faster than most fighters then in service. The production Mosquito Mark V bomber entering service with Squadron 105 in November 1941 could sustain 380 lit at altitude. That made it faster than the Bf-109F, faster than the FW-19A in service at the time, and catastrophically faster than any German predictions suggested a wooden bomber could achieve. German fighter pilots who first encountered Mosquitoes over the Channel in early 1942 reported their disbelief. The twin-engine bomber they'd been told to intercept simply accelerated away. Messerschmitt 109s diving from altitude with built-up speed could barely close the distance. And the moment they pulled out of their dives, the Mosquito was gone. The Fährwerk 190, Germany's finest fighter, could match the Mosquito's straight-line speed, but couldn't catch one that had any warning and a few seconds head start. Looked rougher. Intelligence revised their estimates 3 times between December 1941 and March 1942, each time increasing the Mosquito's performance figures, each time having those new estimates proven conservative. The furniture bomber was becoming Germany's worst nightmare. An aircraft that could penetrate defended airspace precisely because it refused to fight. It simply went around and over and through defenses faster than anything could catch it. But speed alone wasn't enough. Someone needed to prove the Mosquito could exploit that speed at altitudes where German flak was deadliest. Someone needed to fly where no sane pilot would go. Geoffrey de Havilland Junior wasn't just Britain's chief test pilot. He was the son of the man who'd staked his company's reputation on the wooden bomber. That made the brief he received in January 1942 both professional obligation and family legacy. The Air Ministry had authorized limited Mosquito production, but skepticism remained entrenched at Bomber Command headquarters. Air Marshal Harris wanted proof that this elegant speedster could actually survive the missions he needed flown. Specifically, he wanted evidence that speed could defeat flak at the altitudes where flak killed most efficiently. The challenge was deceptively simple. Demonstrate that a Mosquito could penetrate defended airspace at extreme low level below 200 feet at maximum speed, making accurate German fire control solutions mathematically impossible. Not theoretically impossible on paper, actually impossible. Proven in front of witnesses who would report directly to Harris. The alternative was watching Mosquito production scaled in favor of more conventional bombers. The Havilland Aircraft Company had already committed to manufacturing facilities at Hatfield, Leavesden, and Sperry Hall. Thousands of jobs, millions of pounds, and Britain's entire investment in fast bomber doctrine rode on what young Geoffrey could prove. He was 30 years old, though he looked younger. Slight build, dark hair, the kind of quiet intensity that made ground crews nervous when he walked towards an aircraft. He'd been testing de Havilland designs since 1936, accumulating more hours on prototype aircraft than most combat pilots flew in entire tours. His logbook included first flights of the Flamingo, extensive work on the Albatross, and over 200 hours on various Mosquito prototypes. He understood the aircraft's handling characteristics better than anyone alive, including the engineers who'd drawn the blueprints. The technical requirements bordered on suicidal by conventional standards. German 88mm flak guns could depress to engage targets at 500 feet, though their effectiveness decreased dramatically below that altitude. British intelligence estimated that below 200 feet, the time required for German optical rangefinders to acquire, track, and provide firing solutions exceeded the time a fast-moving aircraft remained within effective range. But that calculation assumed the aircraft maintained 350 mat minimum. Slower and the guns could track. Faster was better, but pushed airframes into unexplored stress territories. De Havilland faced additional complications beyond simply flying fast and low. The demonstration needed to be visible, documented, and replaceable. That meant flying over a controlled environment where observers could accurately judge altitude and speed. It meant maintaining that profile long enough to prove it wasn't a brief stunt, but a sustainable combat tactic. And it meant doing this in an aircraft loaded to combat weight, not a stripped-down demonstration special. The physics were unforgiving. At 200 feet and 380 mpes, you covered 111 yd/s. Your reaction time to obstacles, wind gusts, or mechanical failures shrank to fractions of a second. The Mosquito's wooden wings, for all their strength, flexed under load in ways metal wings didn't. Engineers had calculated safety margins, but those calculations assumed normal flight regimes, not sustained maximum speed flight at altitudes where a sneeze could put your propellers into the ground. De Havilland spent February 1942 preparing. He flew dozens of low-level passes over the Hertfordshire countryside, each one lower and faster than the last, learning exactly how the Mosquito behaved when the ground was close enough to see individual sheep. He studied German flak doctrine, reviewing intelligence reports on gun traverse speeds and fire control computer limitations. He calculated fuel consumption at maximum continuous power, bomb load effects on handling, and escape routes if anything went catastrophically wrong. By late February, he was ready to prove his father's vision or destroy it spectacularly. The morning of 25th of February, 1943 dawned cold and clear over Hampshire. Perfect conditions for ending a career or starting a revolution. Geoffrey de Havilland climbed into Mosquito W4050 at Hatfield just after 8 o'clock, knowing that within 2 hours he'd either validate everything his father's company had built or provide Air Ministry skeptics with definitive proof that the wooden bomber was a liability. A delegation from Bomber Command headquarters had assembled at RAF Farnborough 30 miles south, including several group captains who'd already drafted recommendations to scale Mosquito production. He'd spent 11 months preparing for this single demonstration. Not just the dozens of practice runs over Hertfordshire fields, but the careful political groundwork required to arrange an official test under controlled conditions. Harris wanted proof that could be photographed, timed, and witnessed by multiple observers. Farnborough's extensive facilities offered all three, plus a 2-mile approach corridor that would let him build speed before crossing the airfield boundary at maximum velocity and minimum altitude. W450 lifted off at 0843 hours, climbing to 3,000 feet whilst de Havilland ran through systems checks. The aircraft carried simulated bomb load ballast position to replicate operational center of gravity with a full weapons bay. Both Merlin engines were running at standard military power settings. Fuel load was combat typical and airframe configuration matched what squadron pilots would fly over occupied Europe. This wasn't a demonstration special. This was a front-line bomber. He began his run from 5 miles north, descending steadily whilst pushing both throttles forward to maximum continuous power. Through 2,000 feet, airspeed climbing past 300 mph, through 1,000 feet at 340 Mach, the Hertfordshire countryside blurring into green-brown streaks beneath the wings. At 500 feet he leveled briefly, letting speed build to 370 mm, then pushed the nose down again in a shallow dive that brought him screaming towards Farn's northern boundary at 20 feet above the grass. The observers saw him coming. Heard him first actually. The distinctive howl of two Merlin at full power building from a distant wasp buzz to a thunderous roar that rattled windows in the control tower. Then the Mosquito itself appeared impossibly low, impossibly fast, crossing the airfield boundary with perhaps 15 feet of clearance. Ground crews later reported feeling the prop wash as he passed. The hurricane force blast from two propellers spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute. De Havilland held that altitude across the entire airfield. 2 miles of sustained flight at maximum speed and minimum clearance. Observers with stopwatches clocked him at 19 seconds boundary to boundary, which worked out to precisely 379 mil. He'd maintained 22 feet average altitude, never varying more than 5 feet up or down, despite flying through ground turbulence that would have made most pilots pull up to safer heights. The Mosquito's wooden wings flexed visibly under the aerodynamic loads, bending upward by several feet at the tips, a sight that made several watching engineers physically ooze. Then he was past, climbing away towards the south, banking gently to set up for a second demonstration pass from the opposite direction. He made that pass at 0856 hours, 23 feet altitude, 380 to 80 b, then a third at 09-01. This time adding a climbing turn at the far end that pulled 4 gs and demonstrated the airframe's structural margins under combat maneuvers. The watching group captains stopped taking notes. They simply stared because de Havilland had just proven something that rewrote bombing doctrine. A German 80mm crew tracking that Mosquito would have had roughly 4.7 seconds from first visual acquisition until the aircraft exited their effective range. Their fire control predictor needed 6 seconds minimum to calculate and execute a firing solution. The mathematics weren't close. They were impossible. Speed had beaten statistics. The German 88 Moni Flak 37 wasn't just a gun. It was the visible end of an entire fire control system that represented the pinnacle of 1940s mechanical computation. Understanding why de Havilland's demonstration was revolutionary requires understanding what his Mosquito was actually racing against. Not men and shells, but time itself. And the fundamental limitations of analog predictive systems that couldn't calculate fast enough to hit what they could barely track. Start with the gun itself. The at-limit fired a shell weighing 20.3 pounds at a muzzle velocity of roughly 2,690 feet per s. That sounds devastatingly fast until you realize that a shell climbing to altitude loses velocity dramatically due to air resistance and gravity. By the time an 88mm shell reached 2,000 feet, a typical medium-altitude bombing height, it was traveling perhaps 1/400 feet per s and still decelerating. More critically, it took roughly 4 seconds for that shell to reach 2,000 feet after leaving the barrel. 4 seconds during which the target aircraft had moved. The fire control predictor, typically a commando direct 40 coupled with optical rangefinders, existed to solve that movement problem. German crews needed to determine where their target would be 4 seconds in the future, not where it was now. The predictor was an electromechanical computer roughly the size of a small desk weighing over 550 pounds that accepted inputs for target altitude, bearing, velocity, wind speed, and rate of climb or descent. It calculated lead angles and fuse settings. Then transmitted those solutions to the gun via electrical servos that automatically adjusted traverse and elevation. The process required sequential steps that consumed time. First, optical rangefinders had to acquire the target and hold lock for at least 2 seconds to establish accurate distance. Experienced crews could sometimes manage this in 1.5 seconds under ideal conditions, but that assumed clear visibility and a target maintaining straight and level flight. Second, the predictor needed continuous tracking data. At least 3 seconds of observation to calculate velocity and direction accurately. Third, the computed firing solution had to be transmitted to the gun servos, which then physically traversed the barrel to the correct bearing and elevation. Another 1 to 2 seconds, depending on how far the gun needed to move. Total time from initial acquisition to firing: 5 to 7 seconds for an experienced crew under optimal conditions. Average crews needed 8 to 10 seconds. And this was assuming the target cooperated by flying predictably. Now apply those numbers to a Mosquito at 20 feet altitude traveling 300 to Mach. At that height, the effective horizontal range of an 88mm gun was roughly 1,200 yards. Beyond that distance, the shell's trajectory couldn't be depressed enough to hit ground-level targets without the gun literally shooting into the terrain. 1,200 YD at 300mm equals 5.8 seconds of exposure time total. But the Mosquito didn't appear stationary at 1,200 YD waiting to be tracked. It appeared suddenly, already close, already moving at full speed, giving German crews perhaps 3 seconds of warning before entering the zone where fire control solutions needed to be executed. The mathematics were brutally simple. By the time German predictors calculated where to shoot, the Mosquito had already departed that piece of sky. The shell would detonate in empty air whilst the aircraft was already hundreds of yards away. And unlike high-altitude bombing where aircraft maintained steady courses during bomb runs, a low-level Mosquito pilot could weave, or simply exploit terrain masking without sacrificing significant speed. Even German attempts at barrage fire, filling the sky with shells and hoping for probability, failed against extreme low-level attackers. Barrage effectiveness depended on forcing targets through predicted zones. But at 20 feet, there was no forcing. The Mosquito was already below most terrain features, masked by trees, buildings, hills. By the time gunners saw it, computed a solution, and fired, they were shooting at a memory. Physics had beaten engineering. Speed had rendered prediction obsolete. Harris didn't wait for formal reports or committee approvals. Within days of witnessing the Farb-Ara demonstrations and similar low-level trials conducted throughout late 1942, Bomber Command headquarters began drafting operational orders for what would become the Mosquito's coming out party. A daylight precision strike against the Philips Works in Eindhoven, Holland. The target was strategically perfect for demonstrating the new tactics, heavily defended, deep in occupied territory and producing electronic valves that German radar and communication systems desperately needed. Destroying it would hurt Germany's war effort, whilst proving the Mosquito could accomplish what conventional bombers could not. The mission received the code name Operation Oyster and planning began in early November 1942. Harris assigned it to Squadrons 105 and 139, the only two Mosquito bomber units then operational, along with Ventura medium bombers from II Group that would provide additional strike capacity. The Mosquitoes would lead, flying at extreme low level, exactly as de Havilland had demonstrated, penetrating Dutch airspace at treetop height, hitting the target in broad daylight and escaping before German fighters could react. Flight Lieutenant Ted Sismar, leading 105 Squadrons formation, received his briefing on 4 December. The route would take them across the North Sea at 50 feet, make landfall near the Scheldt estuary, then navigate across Holland using roads and railways as visual references whilst maintaining 100 feet maximum altitude. Speed would be everything. Cross the Dutch coast at 330 m each. Accelerate to maximum velocity approaching Eindhoven. Strike the target and exit at full power before flak batteries could establish tracking solutions. Total time over defended territory, roughly 12 minutes. The morning of 6 December, 1942 delivered perfect flying weather, Clear skies, good visibility, light winds. 14 mosquitoes lifted off from RAF Moham and RAF Orcham St. Faith between 11:20 and 11:25 hours, formed up over the wash and headed east at wave top height. German coastal radar detected aircraft crossing into Dutch airspace at 128 hours but struggled to maintain contact. The mosquitoes were simply too low. Their wooden construction providing minimal radar return. By the time Luftwaffe fighter controllers scrambled Focke-Wulf 190s from Gilserian airfield, the mosquitoes were already approaching Eindhoven. Sismar's formation reached the target at 1,230 hours, climbing to 400 feet for their bombing runs. The Philips factory complex sprawled across 60 acres. Radio valve production in the main building, lamp manufacturing in adjacent structures, research laboratories, warehouses. German flak batteries ringing the facility opened fire immediately, throwing up 80M and 37M shells in a desperate barrage. But the mosquitoes were already through the engagement zone, bombs falling, turning hard away before predictor crews could calculate effective solutions. The strike was devastatingly accurate. 14 mosquitoes dropped 56 500-pound bombs across the factory complex in under 90 seconds. Post-raid reconnaissance showed the main valve production building gutted, 3 secondary workshops destroyed, and the entire facility's output capability reduced by an estimated 75%. German reports confirmed that Philips production didn't return to pre-raid levels for nearly 9 months. One critical facility struck by precision bombing in daylight suffered more damage than Hamburg had sustained from multiple night raids by hundreds of heavy bombers. The mosquitoes' escape was equally impressive. All 14 aircraft exited Eindhoven before German fighters arrived overhead. One mosquito took flak damage. DZA-414 flown by Flight Lieutenant Gordon Carter suffered hits to the starboard engine cowling, but maintained speed and made it back to Moham. The Venturas following behind weren't as fortunate. German fighters caught them at altitude and shot down several, but the mosquitoes were already crossing the Dutch coast outbound when those combats began. Harris had his proof. Precision, speed, and extreme low-level tactics worked exactly as the Havilland's demonstrations had promised. Within 48 hours, he authorized expanding mosquito operations across 2 groups and began pushing the Ministry of Aircraft Production to accelerate manufacturing. The wooden wonder had just rewritten the rules. Berlin had never been touched by daylight bombing, not once since the war began. The capital of the Third Reich sat deep inside German territory, protected by hundreds of flak batteries, squadrons of fighters, and the simple mathematics of distance that put it beyond the range of any Allied bomber that could survive the journey. Luftwaffe commanders considered it untouchable during daylight hours, and Hermann Göring had publicly guaranteed that no enemy aircraft would ever bomb Berlin whilst he commanded Germany's air defenses. That boast was about to become the most embarrassing moment of his career. Squadron leader Bob Reynolds received the mission brief at Moham on 27 January 1943. 3 mosquitoes, just 3, would strike Berlin in broad daylight on the morning of 30 January. The date wasn't coincidental. That morning, Göring was scheduled to deliver a major address commemorating the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. The entire Nazi leadership would be assembled. The speech would be broadcast across Germany and transmitted internationally. And precisely as Göring spoke about German invincibility, RAF mosquitoes would be dropping bombs on his capital. The audacity was breathtaking. Berlin sat roughly 600 m from the English coast. Conventional bombers needed fighter escort to survive that distance, but no Allied fighter had the range. Heavy bombers could reach Berlin, but only at night, accepting horrific losses and scatterbombing city districts rather than hitting specific targets. 3 wooden mosquitoes proposed to do what entire bomber streams couldn't. Penetrate to Germany's heart in daylight, strike a target, and return safely. Reynolds' squadron leader Darling and Flight Left Lieutenant Archie Gilchrist lifted off from Moham at 10:30 hours on 30 January. Their Mosquito Mark falls loaded with 4 500-pound bombs each. They crossed the North Sea at 50 feet, made landfall near Cuxhaven at 11:45 hours, then turned southeast toward Berlin whilst maintaining 100 feet altitude. German radar stations detected them intermittently, but couldn't maintain tracking. The Mosquitoes weaved between hills and forests, using terrain masking exactly as low-level doctrine prescribed. At 1200 hours, precisely as Goering began his speech at the Air Ministry building in Berlin, Reynolds formation was crossing the city's northeastern defenses. The Mosquitoes climbed to 500 feet, high enough for accurate bombing, low enough to minimize flak exposure time, and accelerated to 300 of a tight. German flak batteries opened fire, but couldn't establish tracking solutions. The Mosquitoes were simply moving too fast. Their approach angle too unexpected. Reynolds' bomb aimer released at 1201 hours targeting the broadcast facility near Wilhelmstrasse. 4 500-pounders fell in a tight pattern followed seconds later by Darling's and Gilchrist's loads. The explosions rocked central Berlin including the Air Ministry building where Goering stood mid-speech. The broadcast went dead. Nazi officials scrambled for shelters. Air raid sirens that had never sounded during daylight wailed across the capital. The three Mosquitoes were already diving back to low level, turning northwest at maximum power. Messid 109s and Focke 190s scrambled from Der Biritz and Gatto airfields. But by the time they reached altitude, the raiders were 40 miles away and accelerating. Flak batteries along the escape route fired wildly at targets they could barely track. None came close. Reynolds, Darling, and Gilchrist crossed back over the North Sea at 12:47 hours, landed at Maham at 13:35, and walked into debriefing, having accomplished what every bomber crew in the RAF thought impossible. The propaganda value was incalculable. Goering's speech resumed 15 minutes later, but the damage was done. Berlin had been bombed in daylight whilst the Reichsmarschall promised it couldn't happen. 3 wooden airplanes built from furniture materials had humiliated the Luftwaffe in front of the entire German nation. Radio intercepts from Berlin that afternoon captured German officials demanding explanations. Furious that supposedly obsolete British bombers had penetrated defenses nobody thought could be breached. De Havilland's demonstration at Farad 10 months earlier had proven the theory. Berlin proved it could win wars. German engineers weren't stupid. They recognized immediately that the Mosquito raids exposed a fundamental vulnerability in their defensive doctrine. And throughout 1943, they threw resources at solving the problem. Ryan Metal Borsig received contracts to develop faster traversing gun mounts. Crew worked on improved predictors with electronic rather than electromechanical computation. The Luftwaffe's technical divisions tested proximity-fused shells that would detonate automatically when passing near aircraft, eliminating the need for precise altitude calculations. None of it worked, not because the engineering was faulty, but because the physics remained unchanged. The improved Flak 3741 mount entering service in mid-1943 could traverse horizontally at 15 degrees/s, roughly 40% faster than standard mounts. This was genuinely impressive engineering, requiring entirely redesigned hydraulic systems and stronger mounting pedestals to handle the increased mechanical stresses. In theory, it reduced the time needed to swing a gun onto a fast-moving target from 2 seconds to 1.4 seconds. In practice, against a Mosquito crossing at 380 maybe at 20 feet altitude, that half-second improvement was meaningless. The predictor still needed 3 seconds of tracking data. The shell still needed 4 seconds to reach altitude. The Mosquito still covered 1,200 yards in 5.8 seconds total. Proximity fuses represented Germany's most sophisticated attempt at a technological solution. The Cranwich acoustic fuse tested extensively in late 1943 used a miniature microphone system to detect aircraft engine noise and trigger detonation when sound intensity reached predetermined levels. It was brilliant in concept. Eliminating the need to predict exact altitude meant shells could detonate whenever they passed sufficiently close to a target. The technical challenges were extraordinary. Cramming vacuum tubes and batteries into a shell casing designed to survive 8,000 gs of acceleration required entirely new manufacturing techniques. The first combat trials happened in December 1943 against Mosquito formations attacking V weapon sites in northern France. German gunners reported numerous premature detonations, shells exploding too far from targets to cause damage or sometimes detonating immediately after leaving the barrel when acoustic triggers detected the gun's own muzzle blast. Engineers revised the fuse design 3 times between January and March 1944, adding filters to screen out low-frequency sounds and delay circuits to prevent premature triggering. By April 1944, they had a working system that detonated reliably within 70 yards of aircraft. It still couldn't catch mosquitoes. The fundamental problem remained time. Acoustic fuses didn't accelerate shells or extend their effective range. A Mosquito pilot with 3 seconds warning could be out of the engagement zone before a proximity fused shell arrived at his former position. And unlike high-altitude bombers that had to maintain steady courses during bombing runs, low-level Mosquitoes could violently without significantly impacting their speed or bombing accuracy. Pilots learned to watch for muzzle flashes, count 2 seconds, then brake hard left or right. By the time the shell reached them, they'd moved 25 yards laterally, well outside proximity fuse triggering range. German fighter tactics evolved similarly. Messerschmitt developed the Mi-262 jet fighter partially because conventional piston fighters couldn't reliably intercept Mosquitoes. The 262 could reach 540 m to a ph, theoretically fast enough to chase down any Allied aircraft, but it required long runways for takeoff, consumed fuel voraciously, and couldn't operate below 10,000 feet safely due to engine reliability issues. Mosquitoes striking targets in Holland or northern Germany were usually back over the North Sea before Mi-262s could scramble, climb to safe altitude, and attempt interception. Even when 262s did catch Mosquitoes, the closing speed differentials made accurate gunnery nearly impossible. You had perhaps 2 seconds of firing time before overshooting your target. The Luftwaffe's technical journals from late 1944 make sobering reading. Engineers openly acknowledged that no gun traverse rate, no fuse proximity, no predictor speed could overcome the time-distance equation when targets moved above 350 miles mage at extreme low altitude. They'd been beaten by basic calculus, not superior enemy engineering. Speed had proven to be the ultimate defensive weapon. Not armor, not guns, not evasion, just pure velocity that rendered predictive fire control obsolete. The wooden bomber built from furniture materials had created a tactical problem that German engineering, for all its sophistication, simply couldn't solve. Geoffrey de Havilland's demonstration at Farnborough lasted 19 seconds. That brief pass at 22 feet altitude permanently altered how air forces thought about strategic bombing, air defense, and the relationship between speed and survivability. Within 18 months of that February morning in 1943, the Mosquito Force had grown from 2 squadrons to 26, conducting operations that ranged from precision strikes on Gestapo headquarters to pathfinding for 1,000 bomber raids. But the aircraft's tactical success was merely the visible manifestation of something deeper. A fundamental revision of doctrine that influenced jet-age warfare and persists in modern strike planning. Bomber Command's shift was immediate and dramatic. Harris had spent 1942 building a strategic bombing force predicated on overwhelming numbers. The theory that enough heavy bombers could saturate defenses through sheer volume. The 1,000 bomber raids on Cologne, Essen, and Bremen were expressions of that philosophy. Each mission cost 3 to 5% losses deemed acceptable because the force was large enough to sustain attrition. The Mosquito offered a completely different equation. Surgical strikes by small formations achieving strategic effects whilst suffering minimal losses. By mid-1943, Mosquito squadrons were conducting precision raids on targets that would have required hundreds of Lancasters, Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, Shell House in Amsterdam, Amy prison with accuracy that night bombing fleets couldn't approach. The broader Allied air forces absorbed the lesson quickly. The United States Army Air Forces, initially skeptical of British emphasis on speed over armament, began developing their own high-speed strike concepts. The P-38 Lightning, originally designed as a fighter, gained recognition as a low-level precision bomber in the Mediterranean theater. The A-26 Invader entering service in late 1944 incorporated Mosquito-influenced design philosophy. High speed, light defensive armament, emphasis on penetrating defenses through velocity rather than firepower. American strategic bombing doctrine, whilst never abandoning daylight mass formations, increasingly recognized that certain targets demanded precision tools rather than sledgehammers. The post-war development of jet strike aircraft drew directly from Mosquito operations. Britain's English electric Canra entering service in 1951 was explicitly designed as a jet-powered Mosquito successor. High-altitude speed combined with low-level penetration capability, minimal defensive armament, emphasis on reaching targets before defenses could react. The United States Martin B-57 and Americanized Canberra served throughout the Cold War in reconnaissance and strike roles that replicated Mosquito mission profiles at jet speeds. Soviet designers created the Yakov Yak-28 following similar principles, speed and altitude performance as primary defensive measures. The Vietnam War validated these concepts under modern conditions. F-4 Phantom strikes on bridges and rail yards in North Vietnam employed tactics that would have been recognizable to Squadron 105 veterans. High speed, low-level approaches, precision weapon delivery, rapid egress before surface-to-air missile batteries could establish tracking solutions. The fundamental equation remained unchanged. Time to target versus time to calculate firing solution. Modern radar predictors were faster than German mechanical computers, but modern strike aircraft were proportionally faster than Mosquitoes. Physics still favored speed. Contemporary doctrines for penetrating integrated air defense systems, stealth, electronic warfare, standoff weapons are sophisticated descendants of the simple revelation that emerged from FARA in 1943. You can overwhelm defenses through technology or you can outrun them. The latter remains more reliable. The F-111, designed in the 1960s for low-level penetration at supersonic speeds, was a Mosquito enlarged and accelerated to Mach 1.2. The Panavia Tornado serving European air forces into the 21st century employed terrain-following radar to maintain 50-foot altitudes at 600 milant. The same tactical concept de Havilland demonstrated at 389 dBH and 20 feet. One test pilot, one wooden aircraft, 19 seconds of flight that proved speed could defeat statistics. The guns kept firing. The predictors kept calculating, but the targets were already gone. That lesson never expired.